They tossed her aside like a cruel joke, but each tear became a burning ember when the entire village discovered that underestimating an abandoned woman is to invite a revolt no one dared to stop. The wind whipping down from the mountains of the Chihuahuan Desert carried the cruel laughter of the men as they retreated from the banks of the Rio Conchos, leaving behind the burden they no longer wished to bear. On the stony ground, Esperanza gasped for air, swallowing her humiliation, feeling the ropes binding her wrists cut not only her dark skin, but what little remained of her dignity as a woman. She was barren, they said, and therefore useless to the Mendoza family. She had given her husband no children, her father-in-law no grandchildren, no honor to the name that now discarded her like an old mule. The riverbank swallowed the sound of their laughter, but the echo of shame lingered over. The wet stones, a reminder that for the rejected, even the murmur of water wounds. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll keep you posted. Among the twisted mesquite trees, a figure stood motionless like a salt statue, observing the scene with eyes that had long forgotten how to cry. Diego Herrera, the man the land itself seemed to have forgotten, breathed slowly, controlling the rage fermenting in his chest like poorly distilled tequila. He'd lived alone on those banks for 3 years, ever since the fever had taken his Elena and little Mateo, leaving him with nothing but a half-collapsed adobe shack and a soul that refused to heal. It was the sound of the rope snapping against the stones that awakened something dormant within him, a spark of humanity that isolation had tried to extinguish. Her body, abandoned as an offering to the vultures, ignited in him a silent fury that needed no words, no explanation. With precise movements, the sharp knife sliced through the sisal fibers, freeing hands no one else wanted to touch. Esperanza lifted her brown eyes clouded with tears and dust, meeting a sun-baked face etched with scars that told tales of a life too hard to bear alone. No promises were exchanged, just his simple gesture of throwing his serape over her trembling shoulders, a cloak that spoke louder than any vow of protection. The path between the riverbank and Diego's makeshift refuge wound through scrub brush and loose rocks that tumbled beneath Esperanza's bare feet. Each step left marks in the dry earth that the desert wind tried to erase before they were fully imprinted. The midday heat bit through her tattered clothes, a reminder that there was no room for gratitude when an empty stomach ached more than wounded pride. Still, Diego guided her patiently, shouldering some of the burden she couldn't carry herself, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign that the Mendozas might have changed their minds. When they reached the small clearing where the adobe hut stood, the golden light of late afternoon revealed unexpected company. Sitting in the shade of a withered tree, 3 small figures huddled together like frightened chicks. 2 girls, no older than 8, in patched dresses and with eyes too large for their thin faces, and a boy even smaller, perhaps 5 years old, all with sun-baked skin and the wary look of those who learned too early that the world isn't a safe place for the weak. Carmela's children, Diego murmured, more to himself than to Esperanza. She left 2 weeks ago. The word hung heavy, burdened with a grief he knew all too well. Esperanza watched the children, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the rope marks still visible on her wrists. The older girl, whom Diego called Lucy, held her, little brother's hand with a fierce protectiveness that contrasted sharply with her own fragility. The other girl, Paloma, huddled against the tree as if she wanted to disappear into its rough bark. The boy, Pepe, sucked his thumb with an intensity that spoke of a deep-seated hunger, the kind that goes beyond the stomach and devours hope. "We can't feed any more people," Diego said, but his voice betrayed the hardness of his words. Esperanza didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly approached the children, like someone approaching wounded animals. Lucy lifted her chin defiantly, ready to defend her siblings even if it cost her own life. But when Esperanza knelt before them and extended her empty hands in a universal gesture of peace, something shifted in the clearing's atmosphere. "I can sew," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I can cook, with very little." The words were simple, unadorned, yet carried a truth that Diego immediately recognized. This woman, discarded by her own family as worthless, was offering the only thing she still possessed, her ability to nurture and protect. Pepe was the first to relent, releasing his thumb to extend a small dirty hand towards Esperanza. When she took that tiny hand in hers, still marked by the ropes, it was as if a circuit closed, connecting 5 lost souls in a silent promise of mutual survival. That first night, while the children slept, huddled in rags around a fire, Diego fed with dry mesquite, branches, Esperanza stayed awake, watching their small breaths rise and fall like gentle waves. For the first time in years, she didn't feel useless. For the first time since marrying Ramon Mendoza, Esperanza didn't need permission to exist. The night wind carried the distant howl of coyotes, a reminder that the desert forgave neither the weak nor the unwary. But there, in that small circle of light and human warmth, something new was beginning to bloom amidst the ashes of abandonment, a makeshift family that defied all the rules of blood and name that had governed their lives until then. The first rays of sun found Esperanza already awake, her nimble fingers working on mending the girls' dresses. She'd discovered a forgotten sewing box in a corner of the cabin, likely belonging to Elena, and each stitch she made was a silent prayer for the woman she'd never met. Luz watched every movement with wary curiosity, as if still unable to believe someone would care for them without expecting anything in return. "Why did you let us stay?" the girl asked, her voice carrying a maturity far too cruel for her 8 years. Esperanza paused her needle in midair, meeting those brown eyes that reflected a pain all too familiar. "Because you needed me," she replied simply, returning to her work. Diego returned from the hunt with 2 scrawny rabbits and a handful of wild greens he'd gathered near the river. His expression was grimmer than the night before, and Esperanza noticed how he constantly scanned the horizon, like an animal sensing an approaching storm. While preparing the fire to cook, he mumbled words she had to strain to hear. "I saw tracks near the riverbank. Horseshoes." Esperanza's blood ran cold. She knew the family's pride well, especially that of her brother-in-law Alejandro, who had always seen her infertility as a personal affront to the Mendoza name. If they had discovered she was still alive, they wouldn't rest until they finished what they started. But this time the children would be in danger too. "I don't know," she whispered, keeping her voice low so as not to startle Pepito, who was playing with twigs near her feet. Diego stoked the fire harder than necessary. "I know a place in the mountains, an old abandoned mine." Esperanza shook her head slowly. "They won't give up." She picked Pepito up, feeling the boy's tight grip, a confidence that both warmed and broke her heart. It was Paloma, the quietest girl, who offered the first glimmer of hope. While helping Esperanza hang the washed clothes, she whispered something about Father Miguel and the hidden village. With infinite patience, Esperanza coaxed the story from the frightened child. A priest living in a secluded community in the hills, a man who sheltered the rejected and offered protection against those who abused their power. "My mother talked about him," Paloma continued, her words coming out in painful fragments. "She said that when things got too bad, we could go to him." Diego knew the stories about Father Miguel, whispered in bars and markets like urban legends. They said he'd been ousted from the official church for defending Native Americans and mestizos against powerful landowners, and that he now lived like a wild saint, protecting a community of outcasts somewhere in the mountains. Some called him crazy, others a saint. To Diego at that moment, any protection was worth a try. If he even exists, he's at least a 2-day hike from here, Diego estimated, watching the children playing in the red dirt. The answer arrived in the form of an unexpected traveler. Around noon, when the heat made the air shimmer and dance, a lone figure appeared on the horizon, slowly walking toward the cabin. It was an old man, his white hair gleaming silver in the sun, his simple clothes dusted with the grime of the road. André. His back he carried a heavy burlap sack and a worn wooden staff that told tales of many miles traveled. Diego instinctively reached for the knife at his belt, but Esperanza stopped him with a look. There was something about the old man's posture that didn't suggest a threat, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the tension that had consumed them for days. "Good afternoon, my children," the man greeted them, his voice carrying an accent Esperanza couldn't place. "I'm looking for some shade and, if possible, a drink of water." Diego and Esperanza exchanged quick glances. Strangers were always suspect, especially in times like these, but the children, with the instinctive wisdom of the innocent, approached the old man without fear. Pepito even offered his small gourd of water, a gesture that disarmed any remaining suspicion. "I'm Esperanza," she said, offering him a spot in the shade. The old man smiled, and when he smiled, his whole face transformed, revealing a kindness that came from deep within. "And I am Tomás. Just Tomás." He drank the water slowly, savoring each sip. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Carefully, Esperanza began to tell her story, watching the old man's reactions closely. Tomás listened without interrupting, nodding at the right moments, furrowing his brow when she described the Mendoza's cruelty. When she finished, he remained silent for a long time, looking at each of the children as if he could read their souls. "I know, Father Miguel," he finally said, and the words fell upon the group like rain on dry earth. "He's a good man, one who understands that God's family extends beyond blood ties." Esperanza felt her heart quicken. Would he take us in? "Father Miguel never refuses shelter to those who need protection," Tomás replied. "But the road is dangerous, especially for those being pursued." Diego nodded gravely. "The Mendozas won't rest until they find her." "Then there's no time to waste," Tomás said, rising and leaning on his cane. "We can leave at nightfall when the darkness will protect us." That afternoon, as they prepared for the most important journey of their lives, Esperanza watched Diego teach Luz to identify edible plants, Paloma help pack their meager belongings, and Pepito sleep soundly in Tomás's arms, where he hummed a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. For the first time since she'd been abandoned on the riverbank, Esperanza allowed herself to feel something dangerous and precious: hope. The evening breeze carried the distant scent of dust kicked up by horses, and they all knew, without anyone needing to say it, that the time for decisions was over. It was time to leave in search of a place where families could be chosen by the heart, not dictated by blood. The new moon conspired in favor of the fugitives as they left the adobe hut, now just another empty shadow in the Chihuahuan desert. Tomás guided the small group along trails that seemed to exist only in his memory, winding paths among cacti and rocks that no official map had ever recorded. Esperanza carried Pepito on her back, feeling the boy's weight like an anchor that kept her steady when fear threatened to consume her courage. Luz and Paloma followed behind, hands clasped, stepping in Diego's tracks with the silent determination of those who know there's no turning back. The first day's trek tested everyone's limits. The mountains rose before them like jagged teeth against the sky, and each step upward made the air thinner and breathing harder. Pepito whimpered softly, not understanding why he'd been taken. From the only home he'd ever known, Luz tried to comfort him with made-up stories of adventure and hidden treasure, but her own voice trembled with fatigue and uncertainty. "Paloma?" asked her mother for the 10th time, her small feet bleeding in shoes that had long since lost their soles. Tomás stopped and knelt before her, gently wiping away the dust that blurred her eyes. "A journey isn't measured in miles, sweetheart, but in courage." When the sun reached its merciless peak, Diego found a small cave where they could rest for a few hours. The shade was a blessing, but their water was dwindling faster than Tomás had anticipated. Esperanza dampened a rag and wiped each child's face, trying to alleviate the suffering she saw etched on their expressions. It was then that Luz, the oldest and most observant, pointed to a cloud of dust on the horizon. "Look," she whispered, and they all turned to see what she had spotted. They were horsemen, at least 5 or 6, moving in organized formation across the lowlands. Even from a distance, Diego recognized the arrogant posture of those who ride with authority and purpose. The Mendozas had discovered their escape and were now pursuing them with the single-minded determination of predators who had smelled blood. "Are they close?" Diego asked, instinctively pulling the children deeper into the cave. Tomás studied the horsemen's movements with experienced eyes. "Not yet, but they're following the main trail." He turned to the group, his expression grave. "We need to move now, even in this heat." The walk under the midday sun was torture. Pepito had stopped crying, which worried Esperanza more than his earlier sobs. The boy was dehydrating, His lips were cracked, and his eyes were losing their luster. Diego offered to carry Pepito, but Esperanza refused. The little weight on her back was her responsibility, her silent promise that she would never again let a child be abandoned, as long as she had the strength to protect him. The canyon Tomás had mentioned was a narrow fissure between two red rock walls, so tight they had to walk single file. The temperature was several degrees cooler there, and a small spring trickled, crystal clear water between the stones. It was like finding an oasis in the desert. "We can rest here until nightfall," Tomás announced, and they all collapsed onto the rocks like puppets whose strings had been cut. Esperanza moistened Pepito's lips with the cool water, drop by drop, relieved as he started to respond. Luz and Paloma drank avidly, and for the first time in hours smiled. Diego remained at the canyon entrance, watching the path they had come from, his hand always near his knife. It was during this moment of relative peace that Tomás revealed more about his past and his mission. Sitting on a smooth rock with Pepito asleep in his lap, the old storyteller began to speak in the low voice of someone sharing precious secrets. "I wasn't always just a traveler," he confessed, watching the shadows dance on the rock walls. 20 years ago, I was a teacher at a church school in Guadalajara." Esperanza stopped combing Paloma's tangled hair to listen more closely. There was something in Tomás's voice that spoke of old pain, the kind that leaves invisible but permanent scars. "One day, a powerful rancher decided his land was worth more than our school." Tomás stroked Pepito's head with infinite tenderness. "I lost everything, my job, my home, my purpose." Luz, always curious about the stories of adults who had survived tragedies, asked, "Then what happened?" "He taught me that sometimes we lose everything to discover what truly matters." Diego turned from the entrance, a new look on his face. "I don't count numbers," Tomás smiled. "But I can tell you that every family that arrives at Padre Miguel becomes further proof that goodness still exists in the world. And you," he looked at each of them, "you'll be special." As the afternoon wore on, the distant sound of hooves on stone echoed through the canyon. The riders had found the trail and were approaching. Diego signaled for everyone to be completely silent, and for minutes that felt like hours. They listened to male voices arguing about directions and possibilities. "Oh, so they have to be around here," a gruff voice echoed between the rocks, and Esperanza immediately recognized Alejandro Mendoza's voice. "Maybe they died in the desert," another voice suggested. "Dead or alive, I want her back," Alejandro snarled. "She humiliated our family by running away." The voices gradually faded, but the tension remained in the air like the smell of rain before a storm. Esperanza hugged Pepito tighter, while Luz held Paloma's hand hard enough to leave marks. Diego didn't remove his hand from his knife until the last echo of hooves was lost in the distance. "They'll be back," he said simply. "Yes," Tomás agreed. "But when they return, we'll already be where they can't reach us." When darkness finally fell over the mountains, they resumed their journey. Now they were walking on even more treacherous trails, where one misstep could mean a fatal fall. But they also walked with a renewed determination. They had survived the first day of pursuit, and that gave them a strength they didn't know they possessed. Pepito, invigorated by the water and rest, even managed to walk for a few hours on his own, his small hand held firmly in Esperanza's as a pact of mutual trust. As they climbed higher toward the hidden valley where Father Michael awaited, each of them began to understand they were doing more than escaping a cruel past. They were walking toward a future they would build themselves brick by brick, act by act, one loving gesture at a time. Dawn of the second day brought a discovery that would change everything. When Luz woke first, as she always did, she found Pepito burning with fever, his small body trembling despite the heat radiating from his skin. Esperanza woke to the girl's urgent touch on her shoulder, and one look at the boy's flushed face was enough to send her heart racing in panic. "He's so hot," Luz whispered, her words carrying a fear that belied her 8 years. She had lost her mother to a very similar fever, and the memory of that loss was etched on every worried line of her small forehead. Diego woke to the commotion and immediately assessed the situation with experienced eyes. Pepito was more dehydrated than the hike alone could explain, and small red spots were beginning to appear on his neck and arms. This wasn't just exhaustion, It was a sickness that could kill him in a matter of days if not properly treated. "We have to reach the village today," Tomas said, observing the boy's condition with the gravity of someone who had seen many children fight a similar battle. Father Michael knows herbs and remedies that can save him. The decision meant walking during the hottest part of the day, risking being seen by their pursuers. But looking at Pepito, who could barely keep his eyes open, they all silently agreed. There was no choice. Esperanza scooped the boy into her arms, ignoring her own shaky legs from exhaustion, and they resumed their climb up the steep trails. As they ascended, the landscape changed, dramatically. The red desert rocks gave way to sturdy pines, the air growing damper and cooler. Tiny wildflowers sprang up between the stones, and occasionally they heard the song of birds unknown in the lowlands. It was as if they were entering another world, sheltered and blessed in a way Esperanza couldn't explain. "We're close," Tomas announced as the sun reached its zenith. But it was in this moment of renewed hope that they heard the sound they all dreaded, the distant whinny of horses climbing the mountain behind them. The Mendozas had discovered their trail and were now ascending with the single-minded determination of predators sensing cornered prey. "How many?" Diego asked, scanning. The path they'd come, at least 6, Tomas estimated, counting the echoes bouncing off the rocks. Esperanza looked down at Pepito in her arms, then at Luz and Paloma, who clung to each other with wide, terrified eyes. The reality of the situation was brutal and simple. Carrying a sick child and 2 small ones, they could never outrun determined men on horseback. "Take the children," she said abruptly, her voice calm but firm. "No," Diego replied instantly. "If we all try to run together, we'll all be caught," Esperanza argued, extending Pepito towards him. Luz stepped forward, taking Esperanza's free hand with a firmness that belied her age. "We're a family now." The girl's words touched something deep within Esperanza's heart, but also filled her with an even greater determination to protect these small lives that had become more precious than her own. It was Tomas who offered the unexpected solution. "There's an alternate trail," he said, pointing to what appeared to be a solid rock face. "More dangerous, but it leads straight to the heart of the valley." Diego studied the path indicated. It was true that horses couldn't navigate the loose rocks and narrow passages, but it also meant that a sick child or anyone who stumbled could fall from a height that offered no second chance. "It's our only option," Esperanza said, making the decision for everyone. The climb up the alternative trail tested every ounce of courage and stamina they possessed. Esperanza carried Pepito, now delirious with fever, whispering names of people only he knew. Diego led the way, testing each rock before allowing others to pass. Luz and Paloma helped each other, their small hands finding handholds that larger adults wouldn't be able to use. Halfway up the most treacherous climb, Pepito stopped delirious and fell frighteningly silent. Esperanza pressed her ear to his chest, feeling relief when she found a heartbeat, though weak and irregular. The boy was using his last reserves of energy to stay alive, and she knew they had only a few hours before even those ran out. "Don't give up," she whispered in his ear, her own tears dripping onto his hot face. "We're almost there." It was when they reached the top of the most dangerous passage that they saw the valley for the first time. Stretching out below them like a hidden green jewel nestled among stone mountains was a community that seemed to have sprung from a dream. Small adobe houses with flourishing gardens, children playing near a crystal-clear stream, and at the center of it all, a small church, whose bell tower rose like a beacon of hope. There, Tomas pointed to a figure dressed in brown working in a garden near the church. Even from a distance, there was something about the man's posture that radiated peace and moral authority. When he looked up and saw the small group descending the steep trail, he immediately dropped his tools and ran toward them with an agility surprising for a man in his 50s. "Tomas, my friend," Father Michael greeted, but his eyes were already assessing Pepito's critical condition. There were no questions about who they were or where they came from, no hesitation or judgment. Within minutes, Pepito was lying on a clean cot, while Father Michael prepared an herbal tea that filled the room with an earthy, comforting aroma. Esperanza held the boy's small hand, watching the priest's every move with the intensity of a mother protecting her cub. "He'll survive," Father Michael said finally, after carefully examining Pepito. The fever is high, but it's not what will kill him. Esperanza collapsed in tears of relief, all the tension of the past few days finally finding release. Luz and Paloma approached, embracing her with the same need for comfort that she felt. Diego, leaning against the wall, watched the scene with an expression that mixed relief and something deeper, the understanding that they had found not just shelter, but a new home. Father Michael sat beside them, his calloused but gentle hands resting on the girls' heads. "Welcome to Hope Valley," he said simply. Through the open window, the sound of distant bells echoed through the mountains, not from his church, but from the outside world they had left behind. Somewhere, down below, the Mendozas were still searching for them, still fueled by their thirst for revenge. But here, in this hidden valley where time seemed to follow different laws, Esperanza finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over and that a new chapter was just beginning. The peace of Hope Valley lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of restored color in Pepito's cheeks and laughter. 3 days of Luz and Paloma discovering other children willing to share toys and stories. 3 days of Esperanza beginning to believe she'd finally found a place where she could simply exist without asking permission. It was on the morning of the 4th day that the church bells began to ring in a pattern she didn't recognize, a pattern that caused every adult in the village to look up with worried expressions. "It's the alarm," Father Michael explained, hurrying toward the bell tower. From atop the tower, the view revealed what everyone feared. 6 horsemen in dusty travel clothes, weapons drawn, were steadily climbing the trail leading down into the valley. Even from a distance, Esperanza recognized the arrogant posture of Alejandro Mendoza on the lead horse, and her blood ran cold as she realized he wasn't just accompanied by his usual cowboys, but also 2 men she didn't know. Hard cases who looked like they solved problems with bullets. "They found me," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. Father Michael descended from the tower with calm but determined movements. He quickly gathered the men of the village, only 8 including Diego, and most were farmers and artisans, not fighters. Against 6 armed and determined men, the odds were grim. "Get the women and children to the church," he instructed. Esperanza shook her head firmly. "No, they came for me." "Esperanza," Diego approached, his hand finding her shoulder. "You don't understand. It's not just about you anymore." He gestured towards Luz and Paloma, who watched the conversation with wide eyes. Diego's words echoed the sentiment of the entire community. In just 3 days, Esperanza had become an integral part of the valley's life, teaching the women new stitches, helping in the community kitchen, and telling stories to the children. Her presence had brought a loving feminine energy that the predominantly male settlement hadn't realized it was missing. When the knights finally arrived at the valley entrance, they found not a frightened community, but an organized defensive formation. Father Michael waited at the front, alone but serene, his simple habit serving as moral armor. Behind him, the men of the settlement positioned themselves in a semicircle, their farming tools transformed into makeshift weapons. And to the side, visible yet protected, Esperanza stood with Luz, Paloma, and Pepito beside her, surrounded by the other women of the community. "Father," Alejandro Mendoza greeted, his voice carrying the thinly veiled contempt that wealthy men feel for clergymen who choose poverty. "In Hope Valley, there is no property, only free souls," Father Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. Alejandro laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the mountain air like a rusty blade. "Mistreated? That woman is a disgrace to the name she bears, barren as salt flats, useless as a broken tool." That's when something extraordinary happened. Luz, the 8-year-old girl who had learned to be far too mature for her age, stepped forward and raised her voice with a courage that surprised everyone. "She's not useless," the girl declared, her voice clear and strong. "She taught me to sew. She helped my brother when he was sick, and she never abandoned us when everyone else did." Paloma joined her sister, then Pepito, forming a small human barricade between Esperanza and the knights. Other children from the settlement, inspired by their example, also approached. In minutes, Esperanza found herself surrounded by a living wall of small bodies, refusing to let her be taken. Alejandro frowned, clearly not expecting resistance. From children. "Get out of the way, you little tykes," he snarled. "Yes, sir," Luz insisted, crossing her arms defiantly. "She chose to be our family, and we chose her too." The girl's observation struck a deep chord not only in Esperanza, but in the entire assembled community. Choice. That was the word that differentiated the valley from the outside world. Here, families were chosen by the heart, not imposed by blood or law. "Enough of this nonsense," Alejandro grumbled, gesturing to his men. "Get the woman." That's when Father Michael stepped forward, placing himself directly in the path of the riders. "Hold it. God's laws are nothing against men's laws," Alejandro growled, but his confidence wavered slightly. There was something in the priests, bearing that recalled moral authorities that even tough men like him had learned to respect in childhood. "Then let's have a test," Father Michael proposed, his voice taking on a quality that silenced even the birds. "Let's see which law is stronger. I declare this woman and these children under God's protection. If your authority is greater than the Creator's, come and take them." The challenge echoed through the mountains like a silent thunderclap. Alejandro looked around, seeing no longer a handful of frightened farmers, but a human wall united by something his wealth and power had never been able to buy: absolute moral conviction. It was at that moment that Esperanza made the bravest decision of her life. She stepped forward, out from the protection of the children and adults, and stood face to face with the man who had tried to destroy her. "Alejandro," she said, her voice stronger than it had been throughout her entire marriage to her brother, "you want to take me back? Then look me in the eyes and tell me why I deserve this." The silence that followed was heavy, like molten lead. Alejandro opened his mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Looking around, he saw faces judging him, not just the valley residents, but his own men, some of whom had wives and daughters and were beginning to question the righteousness of his mission. "You've always been weak," he finally said, but his voice lacked its usual arrogant certainty. "Your brother couldn't accept me for who I was," Esperanza interrupted. "But these children did. These people did." The mountain wind blew between them, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of rushing water. For a moment that felt like an eternity. The future of everyone there hung on the next word spoken, the next choice made. And it was then that Alejandro Mendoza, facing for the first time the true weight of moral strength, discovered that all his wealth and power were no match for a woman who had finally learned her own worth. Alejandro Mendoza's transformation didn't happen like a bolt of lightning, but like dawn slowly dissolving the shadows of night. Before the eyes of that entire community, under the weight of Esperanza's direct challenge, the man who had always used force to impose his will found himself speechless. His own cowboys began exchanging uneasy glances, some remembering their own wives and daughters waiting at home. "Mr. Mendoza," one of the hired hands' voices broke the heavy silence. "Maybe we should go back. This isn't about reclaiming property anymore." Alejandro turned sharply to the man, ready to explode with offended authority, but found only faces reflecting the same uncertainty. For the first time in his life, his absolute certainty of being right began to crack like a poorly built wall under a downpour. It was Pepito who broke the stalemate. The boy, still weak from the fever but quickly regaining his childish vivacity, pulled away from Lucy's hand and walked straight to Alejandro's horse. With the innocence only a child possesses, he held up a small wildflower he'd picked along the way. "For you, sir," he said simply, extending the offering with a smile that knew no hatred or fear. The word "mom" echoed like a church bell among the mountains. Not aunt, not mom, but mom. A title Esperanza had never officially received, but which this child offered with the absolute generosity of a pure heart. Alejandro looked at the small yellow flower, then at the boy's hopeful face, then at Esperanza, who watched the scene with tears silently streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, he truly saw the woman his family had discarded, not as defective property, but as a human being capable of inspiring genuine love in children who had no obligation to love her. "Is she your mom?" he asked Pepito, his voice softer than he intended. "Yes," the boy replied with the absolute certainty of childhood. "She takes care of us." protects us, and she'll never leave." The simplicity of a child's logic completely disarmed the man who had ridden up the mountain thirsting for revenge. Alejandro slowly dismounted, accepted the flower from Pepito's small hands, and for the first time truly looked at Esperanza, not as a useless sister-in-law, but as a woman who had found her own way to be a mother. "Esperanza," he said, and his voice carried something she'd never heard before: respect. He gestured vaguely towards the other riders. "We came here angry." Esperanza remained silent, allowing him to speak until the end. He paused, struggling with words he'd never been forced to say before. Alejandro's apology wasn't spoken directly. Men like him weren't exactly known for verbal humility. Instead, he simply turned to his men and said, "Let's go, Father." Michael stepped forward, extending a hand in peace. "Alejandro Mendoza, you're welcome back to the valley anytime, not as a pursuer, but as a visitor." Alejandro hesitated, then briefly shook the priest's hand. He mounted his horse, but before riding off, he glanced one last time at Esperanza. "Take good care of them," he said simply, and once the sound of hooves faded into the distance, the entire valley seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. But the real celebration began when Luz, Paloma, and Pepito rushed to embrace Esperanza, followed by the other children, then the adults, forming a large circle of affection that enveloped the woman who had arrived just 3 days prior as a refugee and was now embraced as a full member of this chosen family. In the weeks that followed, Hope Valley blossomed in ways that surprised even Father Michael. Esperanza's presence had brought a feminine balance the community hadn't realized it was missing. She organized sewing classes for the younger women, established a community childcare system, and transformed the church's neglected vegetable patch into a thriving garden that fed the entire village. Diego, who had found in Esperanza a reason to believe in the goodness of humanity again, became not just her protector, but her partner. Together, they built a small adobe house on the edge of the valley, with enough rooms for Luz, Paloma, and Pepito, and extra space for the other children who would inevitably arrive, because the valley's reputation as a sanctuary was spreading to neighboring towns. Luz blossomed into the unofficial little teacher for the younger children, instructing them in the letters and numbers she'd picked up by observing Father Michael. Paloma discovered a talent for music and began singing at Sunday Mass, her sweet voice echoing through the mountains like a melodic prayer. Pepito, fully recovered, became the joyful heart of the community, handing out smiles and wildflowers to anyone in need of a little cheer. Tomas continued his travels, but Hope Valley became his home base, the place he always returned to, bringing with him new, broken families who needed to learn that true love isn't defined by blood ties, but by choices of the heart. A year later, when the first orphaned child they'd taken in dared to call Esperanza Mom, she finally understood that her inability to bear biological children had never been a curse. It had simply been the universe preparing her to be a mother in a different, broader, more necessary way. In the small but welcoming church of the valley, Father Michael kept a special book where he recorded not births or deaths, but moments of transformation. When someone arrived broken and left, whole when hate turned to understanding, when families were formed by the power of mutual choice. Esperanza's story filled several pages, not as a unique case, but as the first example of something that would become tradition in Hope Valley. The mountains surrounding this hidden community continued to protect them from the outside world, not as a fortress to exclude, but as a cradle to nurture. And when occasional travelers asked the residents what made their place so special, the answer was always simple and direct. Here, we understand that family is a verb, not a noun. Hope, her hair now touched with silver, her hands bearing the marks of a life spent loving, would often sit on her porch in the afternoons, watching the children play in the creek that ran through the valley. Sometimes she'd remember the woman left to die on the banks of a faraway river, but that memory no longer brought pain. It brought gratitude for discovering that the end of one story can be the beginning of something infinitely better. And when the evening breeze whispered through the pines, carrying children's laughter and the sounds of work songs, everyone in the valley knew they were living daily proof that true love, the kind that chooses to stay when it could leave, That protects when it would be easier to ignore. That builds when it would be simpler to destroy. That love always finds a way to bloom, even in the most unlikely places. Just as Hope discovered her true family waiting for her in a hidden valley nestled among the mountains, sometimes the most powerful stories find their way to our hearts when we least expect them. If this journey touched something within you, why not share that feeling? Leave a comment telling us which moment moved you the most. Give it a like so more people can discover that family is a choice of the heart, and subscribe to follow other stories that celebrate the transformative power of true love. After all, as we learned in Hope Valley, the best things in life happen when people come together simply to care for one another.